Chapter 1: Introduction, Fascination and Myth of the Vikings. Hardly any other era in European history exerts such a strong fascination as the time of the Vikings. They are regarded as fierce warriors, intrepid seafarers, ruthless plunderers, but also as skilled traders, talented craftsmen, and discoverers of new worlds. Between brutal violence and bold thirst for adventure, between myths of gods and the harsh reality of the North, the image we have of the men and women from Scandinavia spans. When we think of the Vikings today, images immediately come to mind. Longships with artistically carved dragon heads gliding through the fog. Men with helmets, often falsely depicted with horns, wielding shields and terrifying villages on the coasts of Europe. But this image is only part of the truth. Behind the legend of the Vikings is a multi-layered culture that shaped Europe in the centuries between the late 8th and 11th centuries, and whose traces are still visible today. The fascination of the Vikings begins with their origins. From the harsh climate of Scandinavia, characterized by fjords, forests, and long winters, came a people who had to come to terms with the harshest conditions. The north was barren, the soil often barren, and living conditions were full of deprivation. But it was precisely this toughness that shaped a society that was characterized by strength, courage, and ingenuity. If you wanted to survive in this world, you had to be skilled in your craft, brave in battle, and persevering in survival. The Viking Age officially began in 793 with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne on the coast of England. This event came as a shock to the Christian world. Pagan warriors from the north suddenly attacked an important religious center out of nowhere, plundered it, and left again. For contemporaries, it was a sign of horror. For historians, it is now considered the symbolic beginning of a century of expansion that changed Europe permanently. But the Vikings were not only looters. They were also merchants who brought their goods from Scandinavia to distant Byzantium and Baghdad. They exchanged amber, furs, and iron for silver, spices, and silk. Their trade routes connected the north with the great civilizations of the south and east. Without the Vikings, the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies would not have been possible to this extent at that time. At the same time, the Vikings were explorers who looked far beyond the horizon. They not only sailed to England, Ireland, and France, but also founded settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and, long before Columbus, even in North America. The stories of Vinland, handed down in the Icelandic sagas, tell of this bold journey into the unknown New World. This made the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent, a testament to their extraordinary skills in navigation and seafaring. The culture of the Vikings was as fascinating as their deeds. Their religion, Norse mythology, was rich in stories about gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja, about world trees, giants, and the fate of the world in Ragnarok. These myths gave people support, orientation, and meaning, and they still shape our imagination today. Their art, from filigree jewelry to ornate runestones, also shows a highly developed aesthetic that goes far beyond the image of the rugged warrior. But the Vikings were not invincible. With the advance of Christianity, the emergence of new kingdoms in Europe, and the changes within their own society, the Viking Age ended in the 11th century. What remained was a profound legacy: Scandinavian dynasties in England, cultural influences in Russia, trade routes across Europe, and legends that lasted for centuries. Why do the Vikings still exert such an attraction today? Perhaps because they are in many ways a symbol of adventure and freedom. They lived in a world in which courage and determination decided over life and death. They ventured out into the unknown, seeking fame, fortune, and recognition, and left behind stories that still fascinate us. At the same time, the history of the Vikings is a mirror of our own time. Their expansion shows how trade and conquest, culture and violence are often inextricably linked. Their myths remind us how important stories are for understanding the world. And their legacy illustrates that even a people from a seemingly remote region was able to change the course of world history. Thus, the story of the Vikings is not a distant past, but a living memory of how people asserted themselves in a harsh world and changed Europe and the world in the process. The myth of the Vikings lives on in films, series, novels, and festivals, but behind the clichés lies a historical reality that is at least as exciting. This script aims to tell the whole story, from its origins in Scandinavia to the raids and discoveries, to the decline and the lasting legacy. It wants to open our eyes to the complexity of the Vikings as warriors, traders, explorers, artists, and people who found their place in history between myth and reality. Chapter 2: The Origins in Scandinavia. To understand the history of the Vikings, you have to look far back into their first raids and discoveries, into the world of Scandinavia in the early centuries after Christ. There, in a barren yet impressive landscape of fjords, dense forests, icy lakes, and long winter nights, a society was formed that would later become one of the most dynamic forces in Europe. The origins of the Vikings lie in this harsh homeland, which shaped its people like hardly any other region. Geography as fate. In the early days, Scandinavia consisted of the territory of today's Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, plus smaller regions such as Finland and Iceland, which later became part of the Viking world. The country was crisscrossed by fjords, bays, and skerries, which offered ideal conditions for seafaring. At the same time, the soil was stony and the climate harsh. Farming was possible, but laborious and not very productive. This field of tension between barren soil and rich coastal landscape determined life. People were forced to find other ways to survive besides agriculture and animal husbandry. They hunted, fished, collected, and traded with neighboring regions. Early on, they developed extraordinary skills in shipbuilding because the sea was not only a threat but also an opportunity. Society before the Viking Age. Before the Viking Age officially began, a well-structured society already existed. Family groups lived in villages, which were held together by blood relations and alliances. At the top were chiefs or local kings, who provided both protection and law and order. Society was hierarchical. Free peasants, warriors, and traders formed the middle class, while slaves, often prisoners of war, occupied the lowest level. Women had remarkable rights compared to other European societies of the time. They could inherit property, divorce, and, in certain cases, even influence political decisions. While this balance was not complete, it shaped the image of a relatively flexible society. The forerunners of the Vikings. Long before 793, the famous raid on Lindisfarne, the Scandinavians were not isolated people. Archaeological finds prove trade contacts with Central Europe, the Roman Empire, and even as far as the Black Sea. Amber from the Baltic Sea found its way into Roman villas, while glass beads and coins made their way north from the south. Weapons, grave goods, and artistic jewelry also show that the people in the north were not just simple farmers, but developed a culture that went far beyond their own needs. In particular, the so-called boat graves, in which the deceased were buried together with their ships, indicate how important seafaring was even in this early phase. Religion and mythology as identity. The origins of the Vikings were closely linked to their religion. Long before Christianity came to the north, people lived in a belief system that was shaped by myths and legends. Odin, the wise god who sought knowledge, Thor, the mighty protector with the hammer Mjolnir, and Freyja, the goddess of love and fertility, they were all part of a pantheon that explained the world. People believed in a close connection between the living and the dead, between the visible world and an invisible one in which gods, giants, and spirits lived. Sacrificial festivals, rituals, and runic inscriptions kept this world alive. This world of faith shaped the self-image of the Scandinavians and gave them the feeling of being part of a great cosmic drama. Reasons for the expansion. But why did the Scandinavians leave their homeland to move to distant countries? The reasons are manifold. On the one hand, it was necessity. The country could not feed everyone. The population was growing, and young men were looking for new ways to gain fame and fortune. On the other hand, it was culture. In a society that valued honor, bravery, and glory above all else, raids and adventures offered the chance to gain prestige. Political factors also played a role. In Scandinavia, there were numerous small kingdoms and chiefdoms that were constantly in competition with each other. Those who could not find a place in their own country simply looked for it outside. In addition, there was the technical superiority. With their ships, which were fast, flexible, and seaworthy, the Scandinavians had a decisive advantage over many neighbors. The beginning of a new era. So when the men from the north began to raid the shores of England, Ireland, and the continent in the late 8th century, it was not a sudden outbreak of violence, but the result of a long development. Its origins lay in the realities of Scandinavia, in a landscape that demanded toughness, in a society that rewarded courage, and in a culture that always kept its eyes on the horizon. The origins of the Vikings are therefore more than just a geographical place. They are a symbol of how people can create great things out of limited possibilities. From barren soils and icy winters, a culture emerged that was to change the world. Chapter 3: Society and Everyday Life in the Nordic Villages. If one wants to understand the history of the Vikings, it is not enough to speak only of their raids and conquests. The foundation of this movement lay in the villages and settlements of Scandinavia, where daily life was characterized by simple but strict structures. Here, between fjords, forests, and barren fields, a society was formed that was determined by necessity on the one hand, and produced an astonishing wealth of culture, community, and traditions on the other. The structure of society. The Viking world was clearly hierarchically structured. At the top were the kings and jarls, powerful chiefs or princes who ruled over the land, warriors, and trading ports. Among them were the freemen, the peasants, craftsmen, and traders. These formed the backbone of society. They owned land, raised livestock, or traded, and had the right to participate in assemblies, the so-called things, where justice was administered and decisions were made. Among them were the thralls, the slaves. They were prisoners of war or people who could not pay debts and had to do hard work. However, in some cases, they were able to regain their freedom and integrate into the community. Women played a special role. Compared to other societies of the early Middle Ages, they had more rights and influence. They could inherit land, conclude contracts, and get divorced. While the men were often traveling, the women ran the farm, managed the harvest, and took care of trade and finances. They were the stable backbone of society, ensuring survival in a harsh world. Everyday life in the village. Life in a Viking village was hard, but determined by clear rhythms. The houses, mostly longhouses made of wood and peat, were simple but functional buildings. People and often animals lived in a single large room, separated by wooden walls or only by open fireplaces. The smoke escaped through an opening in the roof, and during the long winters, the fire provided warmth and community. Everyday life revolved around agriculture and livestock breeding. Men and women worked the fields together, grew barley, rye, and oats, and kept cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. The food was simple: porridge, bread, dairy products, meat, and fish. Salt played a major role in preserving supplies, as did smoking and drying. Children helped with the work at an early age. Girls learned housekeeping, spinning, and weaving from their mothers, while boys were familiarized with the use of tools and weapons. Education in the modern sense hardly existed, but the knowledge was passed on orally from generation to generation. Law and order. A special feature of the Viking world was its legal system. Disputes were not resolved arbitrarily, but before the Thing, a gathering of free men. There, laws were pronounced, guilt and innocence were clarified, and punishments were imposed. These could be fines, but also tougher measures, such as banishment. Blood feuds were not uncommon, but the Thing tried to keep society in balance through rules and balance. Honor played a central role in this system. It determined social rank and was the basis for respect. Those who lost their honor, whether through cowardice, deceit, or breach of promise, also lost their place in the community. Religion in everyday life. The Nordic religion permeated everyday life. Sacrifices to the gods were a matter of course, whether for a good harvest, a safe journey, or in memory of the dead. Small altars in the houses, sacred groves, or large places of worship such as in Uppsala formed the religious center. The seasons were marked by festivals: Yule in winter, sacrifice festivals in spring, and harvest celebrations in autumn. Runes not only served as writing, but also had a magical dimension. They were carved on stones, engraved on weapons, or worn on jewelry. It was believed that they offered protection or gave special powers. trade and travel. Even though many people never spent their lives beyond the village, the connection to the outside world was always present. Merchants brought amber, furs, and iron to distant regions, while bringing back silver, glass, and exotic goods. Markets were important meeting places where not only goods, but also news, stories, and alliances were exchanged. Many villages were located on coasts or rivers, which facilitated access to the sea. The sea was not a border, but a lifeline. Ships connected the villages to other regions, and early on, people learned that wealth and fame could be found beyond the horizon. Community and culture. Despite the hardship, village life was rich in community. Stories and legends were told around the fire, songs were sung, and poetry was recited. Skald poets recorded the deeds of great warriors and kings in verse. This oral tradition was not only entertainment, but also a means of preserving history and values. Festivals played a major role. They strengthened the sense of community and offered a change from everyday life. Feasts with mead, dancing, and games were opportunities to show off, make contacts, and forge alliances. A life between hardship and hope. Life in the Nordic villages was characterized by deprivation, but also by a strong sense of cohesion. Everyone knew that they were dependent on the community. Without neighbors, relatives, and clans, survival in the harsh winters would hardly have been possible. At the same time, there was room for beauty, art, and hope in this life. Jewelry, ornately decorated tools, and runestones testify to the desire to leave traces and create something lasting. Viking society thus arose not only on battlefields or in distant lands, but in the everyday life of these villages. This is where the men and women grew up who later went out into the world. Here they learned values such as courage, honor, community, and independence. Without these roots in the Nordic villages, the great history of the Vikings would never have been possible. Chapter 4. World of Faith and Gods, Odin, Thor, and Freyja. The Vikings lived in a world steeped in myths, gods, and invisible powers. Their religion was not an abstract belief system, but an omnipresent part of everyday life, intertwined with nature, seasons, and fate. In an environment as harsh and unpredictable as the climate of Scandinavia, the gods offered support and orientation. They not only explained the world, but also gave meaning in times of danger, hardship, and hope. The Vikings' worldview. At the center of the Nordic religion was the idea of Yggdrasil, the world tree. This huge tree connected the 9 worlds: Asgard, the home of the gods; Midgard, the world of humans; Hel, the realm of the dead; and many more like Jotunheim, the land of giants. Everything was interconnected, and every being, whether god, man, giant, or dwarf, had its place in this cosmic network. Fate was inevitable for the Vikings. The Norns, 3 mysterious beings, weave the threads of life at the foot of Yggdrasil. They determined when a person was born, how his life went, and when he had to die. This idea gave life a certain hardness, but also a freedom. If fate was fixed anyway, one could face it courageously. Odin, the seeker and lord of battles. Among all the gods, Odin occupied a prominent position. He was the All-Father, ruler of Asgard, and god of wisdom, poetry, and war. But unlike an omnipotent god of the Christian tradition, Odin was an ambivalent figure. He was wise, but also cunning. He could help people, but he could also deceive them. Odin sacrificed himself to gain knowledge. For 9 nights he hung on the world tree Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, until he discovered the secrets of the runes. For the Vikings, this was a symbol of the fact that knowledge cannot be obtained without pain and sacrifice. He also gave his eye to be allowed to drink from the fountain of wisdom. As the god of war, Odin chose the fallen who came to Valhalla. There, the bravest warriors were to train until Ragnarok, the end of the world, to fight alongside Odin against the forces of destruction. For a Viking, it was a great honor to be admitted to Odin's hall, a goal that made courage and bravery in battle the highest virtue. Thor, the protector. If Odin stood for wisdom and cunning, Thor was the god of strength and protection. With his mighty hammer Mjolnir, he fought against the giants, the enemies of the gods, and saved Asgard and Midgard from chaos. His hammer was both a weapon and a symbol of life. It was used at weddings, births, and funerals to give good luck and blessings. Thor was particularly popular with ordinary people. While Odin was often perceived as a distant, mystical figure, Thor was the tangible protector who stood by her side. He traveled in a chariot pulled by 2 goats, and his thunders shook the sky. For the Vikings, every thunderstorm was a sign of his power. Thor embodied qualities that were highly valued in society: courage, strength, reliability. In a world where you often had to fight against the forces of nature and enemies, Thor was a god who promised hope and security. Freyja, the goddess of love and life. In addition to the male gods of war, Freyja played a prominent role. She was the goddess of love, fertility, and beauty, but also of magic and death. Her ambivalence made her a particularly fascinating figure. Freyja owned the chariot pulled by cats and a magical collar, Brisingamen, which symbolized her power. She was not only the goddess of romantic love, but also of passion and sensuality. At the same time, she had a close connection to death. She took half of the fallen into her kingdom, Sessrumnir, while the other half came to Odin in Valhalla. Her connection to magic, especially to cider art, made her the patron saint of sorceresses and seers. Many women in the Viking world found in her a divine role model who embodied strength, self-determination, and female power. Rites and sacrifices. The gods were not distant figures, but part of daily life. Sacrifices were made to gain their favor. Animals, food, sometimes people. These rituals took place in sacred places, in groves, at springs, or in specially built temples. The seasons structured the religious festivals. In winter, the Yule festival was celebrated, which later became the Christian Christmas. In the spring, sacrifices were made to ask for a good harvest, and in the autumn, the gods were thanked for the yield. Death was also strongly influenced by religion. The deceased were often buried with rich burial goods, weapons, jewelry, tools, sometimes even ships. It was believed that the dead would need these things in the next world. Myths as wisdom. The stories about the gods were not only entertainment, but didactic plays. They explained to the people how to master challenges with courage, cunning, and perseverance. They warned against arrogance, showed the value of loyalty and honor, and made it clear that even the gods could not escape fate. The Ragnarok, the prophesied twilight of the gods, was a central motif. It described the end of the world in a gigantic battle, followed by a new, purified world. This idea reflected the reality of the Vikings, the awareness that destruction and new beginnings are inextricably linked. Myths as legacy. The beliefs about the gods were diverse, contradictory, and fascinating, just like the people themselves. She combined hardship with beauty, death with life, fate with freedom. Without these myths and gods, the history of the Vikings would be inconceivable, because they formed the foundation on which their self-image rested. Chapter 5. Trade and Crafts, the Economic Foundation. As much as the image of the Vikings is shaped by warriors and seafarers, it is easy to overlook the fact that their culture rested on a solid economic foundation. Behind the gleaming shields and the dreaded raids were skilled craftsmen, enterprising merchants, and a society that knew how to create an astonishingly extensive network of production and exchange from limited resources. Without trade and crafts, the Vikings would never have been able to achieve the expansion that made them a power in Europe for centuries. The fundamentals of the economy. Scandinavia was not a country of plenty. The soils were stony, the winters long, the harvests uncertain. But the Vikings knew how to make the best of it. Agriculture and livestock breeding formed the basis of supply. Barley, rye, and oats were grown. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats were kept. Fishing played a central role, as did hunting and gathering. But it became clear early on that this basis alone was not enough. To create prosperity, more was needed: manual dexterity and the ability to exchange goods. For this reason, a remarkable variety of professions developed. Mastery of craftsmanship. The Vikings were excellent craftsmen. Archaeological finds bear witness to filigree jewelry made of silver and gold, artistically carved runestones, precisely forged weapons and tools. Blacksmiths were highly regarded because they made swords, axes, spears, and agricultural implements. A good sword was not only considered a weapon, but also a status symbol, often decorated with engravings and passed down from generation to generation. Carpenters and shipbuilders created the famous longships that were at the heart of the Viking expansion. The technique of clinker construction, overlapping planks connected with iron rivets, made the ships stable and flexible at the same time. Jewelry artisans made arm rings, necklaces, and brooches, often with ornate patterns depicting animals, gods, or abstract ornaments. Silver was particularly important because it also served as a means of payment. Textile craftswomen weaved clothes from wool and linen. Colors were obtained from plants, patterns and embroidery gave the garments beauty and individuality. This craftsmanship was not only intended for personal use. Many products were merchandise that was coveted beyond Scandinavia. Markets and trading venues. Trade played a central role in the Viking world. In addition to the seasonal markets in the villages, urban centers developed and became hubs of trade. Places such as Haithabu in Schleswig, Birka in Sweden, or Kaupang in Norway were early cities that flourished through trade. Here, traders from the north met merchants from the Frankish Empire, from England, or even from Byzantium. Amber, furs, walrus teeth, iron, and slaves were typical export goods. In return, silver coins, wine, spices, glass beads, and silk came north. The importance of silver is particularly striking. Scandinavia had hardly any deposits of its own, but trade, especially with the Orient, brought huge amounts of silver to the north. Arabic dirhams found in Viking graves testify to the wide radius of their trade relations. Silver was not only hoarded, but also cut into pieces and used as weight money. Trade routes and reach. The trade routes of the Vikings were impressive. In the west, they led to Ireland, England, France, and as far as Spain. In the east, they followed the great rivers, Neva, Volga, and Dnieper, deep into Russia, where they became known as Rus. From there, they reached Constantinople, which they called Miklagard. Some sources even report trips as far as Baghdad. In this way, they were not only traders, but also intermediaries. They connected the cultures of Northern Europe with Byzantium and the Islamic world. They brought furs and honey to the south and returned with exotic fabrics, coins, and luxury goods. The role of slaves. A dark chapter in the economic life of the Vikings was the slave trade. Many prisoners of war from raids were enslaved and either used in the villages or sold on. Especially in the Orient and Byzantium, there was a demand for slaves from the north. For the Vikings, this was a lucrative source of income, but it overshadows the image of their trade with violence and exploitation. The everyday life of the retailer. Not every Viking was a warrior. Many were merchants who traveled for months. They sailed in small groups, carefully stored their goods in ships, and faced the dangers of the sea, pirates, and foreign rulers. A successful trader could gain great wealth and thus gain influence in his homeland. But trade was more than just a business. It was also a cultural exchange. Not only goods, but also ideas, techniques, and stories came to the north via the trade routes. Christian symbols appeared in jewelry early on, long before the Vikings themselves were baptized. New forms of weapons, coins, and luxury items changed life in the Nordic villages. The connection between trade and robbery. The image of the Vikings as traders and warriors was not a contradiction. Often, both activities went hand in hand. A ship could first plunder and then trade. Some settlements that emerged from raids developed into thriving trading cities. Dublin is a well-known example. This double face of the Vikings, traders and robbers at the same time, made them so unpredictable for their neighbors. They were able to gain wealth in a peaceful way, but they were just as determined to take up arms when the opportunity presented itself. Significance for expansion. Without trade and crafts, the expansion of the Vikings would not have been possible. Their ships, their weapons, their jewels, all this was the result of craftsmanship. Their trade relations brought wealth, which in turn financed wars and expeditions. Their openness to exchange made them bridge builders between cultures. The economic foundation of the Vikings shows that they were much more than mere looters. They were part of a global network that stretched from Scandinavia to the farthest corners of the world at the time. Chapter 6. The First Raids. Lindisfarne, 793. When historians speak of the Viking Age, they almost always name a year as its symbolic beginning, 793. In that year, an attack occurred that shook the Christian world at the time and shaped the reputation of the Vikings as fearless, cruel warriors for centuries. The destination was the monastery of Lindisfarne, a small island on the northeastern coast of England. This attack was interpreted in the chronicles of contemporaries as divine punishment and marked the moment when the people of Europe realized that a new danger was approaching from the north. Lindisfarne, a sacred center. The island of Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, was an important religious center. It was here that Saint Odin founded a monastery in the 7th century, which soon became the starting point for the Christianization of northern England. The monks of Lindisfarne were known for their erudition and magnificent manuscripts, most notably the famous Book of Lindisfarne. For the people of the early Middle Ages, this monastery was not only a place of faith, but also a haven of knowledge and art. But monasteries were not only spiritual centers, they were also wealthy. Treasures of gold and silver, relics, ornate books, and pantries made them attractive targets for robbers, and that's exactly what the Vikings had recognized. The Raid. On 8th June 793, ships sailed from the north to the coast of Lindisfarne. They belonged to men who would later become known as Vikings. They were able to land quickly and silently with their longships. Their warriors jumped ashore and stormed the monastery. The monks, unarmed and unsuspecting, had nothing to oppose the violence. The invaders plundered treasures, destroyed sanctuaries, took prisoners, and left behind a picture of horror. For the Christians of England, this attack was a shock. Not even the holiest places were safe anymore. The Anglo-Saxon chronicler Alcuin wrote in horror, "Never before has the horror of such a plague afflicted our country. They desecrate God's sanctuary and shed the blood of the saints." The impact in Europe. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the first attack by Norsemen on European shores, but it was the first to attract such attention. It hit a religious center of the highest symbolic significance and was immediately interpreted as a sign of God's wrath. In the eyes of Christians, the attackers were pagan demons sent by God to punish the people for their sins. For the Vikings, on the other hand, it was a successful raid. They had shown that their ships could carry them deep into foreign lands, that they could strike quickly and disappear just as quickly. The booty, gold, silver, and prisoners sold as slaves, confirmed that such expeditions were worthwhile. The consequences. After Lindisfarne, further attacks followed. Monasteries on the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, in England and France were targeted. The strategy was simple. Places with wealth but little defense were ideal targets. Monasteries were often located at river mouths and were therefore easily accessible from the sea. In the decades that followed, the coastal inhabitants of Europe were kept in constant fear of the Norsemen. The image of the marauding Viking with axe and sword was born during this time. But for the Scandinavians, it was only one of several strategies to gain wealth, along with trade and diplomacy. Why 793? The question remains, why did the Great Raids begin at the end of the 8th century? Historians cite various reasons. On the one hand, the population in Scandinavia grew, which put pressure on limited resources. Young men who saw no future at home sought adventure and loot abroad. On the other hand, there were political developments. The rise of new kingdoms and the consolidation of power led to some groups moving outwards in order to avoid internal conflicts. Another factor was the ship's technology. The Vikings had perfected their longships. They were light, fast, and could sail on the high seas as well as in shallow rivers. This allowed the Vikings to reach not only coasts, but also destinations deep inland. Finally, the riches of the Christian monasteries also played a role. For pagans, these places had no sacred character. They were simply unarmed treasuries. The beginning of an era. The raid on Lindisfarne was described as a divine omen, but in reality, it was the beginning of a new era, the Viking Age. In the decades that followed, countless ships would sail from Scandinavia's coasts to change the world. They would devastate England and Ireland, terrify France, found new cities, open up trade routes, and even reach distant continents. For the monks of Lindisfarne, June 8, 793 was a day of horror. For the Vikings, however, it was the prelude to a success story that made them heroes in the eyes of their descendants, demons in the eyes of their victims, and legends in the memory of the world. Chapter 7: Vikings and the Sea. Ships, Navigation, and Seafaring. Without the sea, the Vikings would not have become what we associate with their name today. For them, the sea was a lifeline, transport route, source of inspiration, and battlefield at the same time. In a world where roads were rare and dangerous, the sea opened up opportunities, trade, discovery, and raids. At the heart of this maritime culture was the ship, a feat of engineering that made the expansion of the Vikings possible in the first place. The importance of the ship. The ship was much more than just a means of transport for the Vikings. It was a symbol of freedom, power, and connection to the gods. Entire ships were found in graves in which important personalities were buried, an indication that the ship was also intended as a vehicle to the afterlife. In art and myths, ships appear again and again. Even the gods owned legendary ships such as Skidbladnir, which could be folded up and always had favorable winds. For the people of the north, the ship was the ultimate tool to overcome the boundaries of their own world. The longships. The most famous ship of the Vikings was the longship, called Drakar in Old Norse when it was equipped with a dragon's head. These ships were masterpieces of engineering. With the so-called clinker brick construction, overlapping planks that were connected with iron or wooden rivets, the Vikings created ships that were stable and flexible at the same time. Longships could sail on the high seas as well as in shallow rivers. Its shallow keel allowed it to sail close to the coasts or to sail up rivers where other ships would have run aground long ago. This made surprise attacks possible deep inland. The ships were propelled by sails and oars. A large square sail, usually made of wool and often brightly colored, propelled the ship forward, while dozens of oarsmen provided speed in calm conditions or in battle. With a speed of up to 15 knots, the ships were extremely fast for their time. The Knorr and other types of ships. In addition to the longships, the Vikings also used other types of ships. The Knorr was a wider merchant ship that could carry more cargo. It was slower but ideal for transporting goods and animals over long distances. There were also smaller fishing boats and transport ships, which were important for everyday life in Scandinavia. This diversity shows that the Vikings were not only warriors, but also pragmatic seafarers who built the right ship for every purpose. Navigation, the art of orientation. But how did the Vikings find their way across the often endless expanses of the sea? Without modern maps, compasses, or GPS, they developed amazing methods. They used the sun, stars, and the position of the moon for orientation. During the day, landmarks such as mountains or coastlines helped, and on the high seas, the color of the water or the behavior of birds could provide clues. The coasts of Iceland and Greenland in particular have been opened up by the observation of migratory birds. Archaeological finds suggest that the Vikings may have used sun disks or sunstones, crystals that allowed them to determine the position of the sun even when the sky was overcast. Whether this was actually the case has not yet been fully proven, but it shows how much the Vikings are regarded as masters of navigation. Life on board. A trip on a Viking ship was no pleasure. The men sat close together on wooden benches, luggage was stowed below deck, and protection from rain or storm was minimal. On longer journeys, supplies such as dried fish, water, mead, and beer had to be carefully rationed. Nevertheless, the community on a ship was a central part of Viking life. Songs were written here, stories were told, and the men swore in battles or trading trips. The rhythm of the rowers, the creaking of the planks, and the roar of the waves were part of a world in which courage and discipline decided on survival. The sea as a threat and an opportunity. The Vikings knew that the sea could be as deadly as it was beneficial. Storms, fog, and currents were constant dangers. Many ships were lost and entire crews disappeared without a trace. But those who dominated the sea could achieve immeasurable fame and fortune. This is how the Vikings became true masters of the sea. No other people of their time had such superior ship technology and navigation. This gave them a decisive advantage over their opponents. Expansion through seafaring. Thanks to their ships, the Vikings were able to reach vast areas in a short time. They sailed to England, Ireland, and Scotland, penetrated as far as France, and founded settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. In the east, they connected Scandinavia with the trading centers of Byzantium and the Caliphate. Their ships were the tools with which they shook Europe, connected cultures, and conquered new horizons. Without their maritime mastery, the Viking Age would never have become the era we now consider the epitome of adventure and expansion. The legacy. Even today, the ships of the Vikings fascinate. Finds such as the Oseberg ship or the Gokstad ship, which were excavated in Norway, show the beauty and sophistication of their architecture. These ships are not only technical masterpieces, but also symbols of a culture that did not fear the sea, but understood it as part of its identity. For the Vikings, the sea was the gateway to the world. It brought danger and death, but also fame, fortune, and new opportunities. Their ships made them invincible and gave them a freedom that hardly any other people of that time knew. Chapter 8. Warriors and Strategists, Tactics and Weapons. When the name Vikings is mentioned, many immediately think of fierce warriors armed with axe and sword, storming out of their longships and terrifying coastal towns. There is a kernel of truth to this image, but the Vikings were far more than unbridled barbarians. Their warfare was organized, their weapons carefully forged, and their strategies made them formidable opponents that could put even experienced armies of the Middle Ages in trouble. The warrior as an ideal. In Viking culture, the warrior played a prominent role. Courage, bravery, and the willingness to die in battle were central values. Those who fell in battle could hope to be admitted to Odin's Hall Valhalla, where they would prepare for the final battle at Ragnarok. This ideal shaped not only the fighters, but also the entire society. Glory in war was synonymous with honor and prestige. But not every Viking was a warrior. Many were farmers, traders, or craftsmen who took up arms in times of war. Nevertheless, there was also a class of professional warriors who specialized in raids or stood as bodyguards in the service of chiefs and kings. Weapons of the Vikings. The Vikings were known for their weapons, which were both functional and artistically crafted. Swords. The sword was considered the most prestigious weapon. It was expensive to manufacture and a sign of status. Many swords were made using pattern welding technology, in which different metals were artfully joined together. Decorated knobs and engravings made each sword unique. Names such as Ulfbert are still synonymous with the highest art of blacksmithing. Axes. The axe was far more common than the sword. It could be used by farmers as well as warriors and was cheaper to produce. Battle axes were lighter and more manageable than work axes, often with long shafts to be used in close and ranged combat. Spears. The spear was probably the most commonly used weapon. It could be used in hand-to-hand combat or as a throwing weapon. Iron spearheads were easy to make, and their reach made them versatile. Shields. Almost every Viking had a round shield made of wood, reinforced with metal fittings. They served not only for defense, but also as an active weapon in close combat. Painted shields were also a sign of identity. Bows. Even though hand-to-hand combat was at the heart of Viking warfare, bows played an important role. They were used in raids to weaken enemies from a distance before a direct attack occurred. Armor and protection. The idea of the Viking with a horned helmet is a romantic myth of the 19th century. In fact, Vikings wore simple helmets made of iron or leather, often with nose protection. Horns would have been impractical in combat. Most warriors did not wear heavy armor. Chainmail was rare and reserved only for wealthy men. Instead, the protection usually consisted of thick wool or leather clothes. Mobility was often more important than heavy protection, as the battles were fast and dynamic. Strategies and tactics. The Vikings were feared not only for their weapons, but also for their warfare. They relied on surprise and speed. With their longships, they could appear unexpectedly on coasts, strike at lightning speed, and disappear just as quickly. Their tactics were based on flexibility. Raids. Small groups of warriors suddenly landed at a monastery or village, plundered supplies and treasures, and disappeared before a fight could be organized. Battle in formation. When larger battles were necessary, the Vikings used the shield wall. Warriors lined up close together with shields that merged into a protective wall. Behind them, spears could be used and pressure could be exerted on the opponent. Combination of naval and land warfare. Their ships allowed them to penetrate deep into the interior. Rivers such as the Seine or the Thames became highways for quick attacks. Terror and intimidation. The reputation of the Vikings was often as powerful as their weapons. Stories of cruelty and destruction spread quickly, so many villages preferred to pay tributes rather than resist. The Berserkers, warriors in a rush. A special role was played by the Berserkers, legendary warriors who supposedly fought in a frenzy of battle. The term probably derives from bear shirt, as these fighters often wore animal skins. Contemporary accounts describe them as men who fell into a frenzy, no longer felt pain, and fought with superhuman strength. Whether this was a mixture of rituals, drugs, or psychological techniques is still disputed today. The Berserkers were feared by friends and foes alike because they were unpredictable. Some chiefs used them as elite warriors, others avoided them because they were difficult to control even in peacetime. Warriors in the service of foreign masters. The skills of the Vikings were not only in demand in Scandinavia. Many joined foreign rulers as mercenaries. The Varangian Guard in Byzantium, an elite troop of Nordic warriors who protected the Byzantine emperor, is particularly well known. These men brought home not only wealth, but also new fighting techniques and experiences. War as part of culture. For the Vikings, war was not a state of emergency, but a part of their rhythm of life. Summer was the time of raids, while in winter, people returned to the farms. The struggle was closely linked to honor, glory, and religion. But it would be wrong to see the Vikings only as violent barbarians. Their warfare was well thought out, their weapons highly developed, their strategies effective. They combined toughness with intelligence, courage with organization, qualities that made them feared warriors. The legacy of the warriors. The warrior culture of the Vikings lives on to this day in myths, sagas, and symbols. Swords with elaborate inscriptions, axes with decorations, runestones that tell of heroic deeds, all this shows how much society revered the warriors. The Viking warriors were not invincible, but they shaped the image of a fearless people who were ready to go beyond the horizon and face any challenge. Chapter 9. Expansion to the West, British Isles. The Viking Age is inextricably linked to the British Isles. Hardly any other area has been so strongly influenced by the raids, settlements, and political ambitions of the Norsemen as England, Scotland, Ireland, and the surrounding islands. From the first sudden raids to the founding of entire kingdoms, the Vikings developed a chapter of their history here that tells of violence and destruction, but also of integration, trade, and cultural exchange. First raids. After the shock of Lindisfarne in 793, further attacks quickly followed. Monasteries on Iona, in Jarrow, and other coastal points were plundered. The monks were easy targets, for they were rich in treasure and poorly armed. These early raids were usually short and brutal. The Vikings landed, raided, and disappeared before local rulers could organize a defense. Over time, the attacks became more systematic. As early as the 830s, large fleets sailed up the coasts, penetrated deep into the rivers, and plundered cities such as London or Canterbury. Especially in England, where rival kingdoms such as Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex fought for power, the Vikings found fertile ground for their ambitions. From raids to settlements. In the 9th century, the strategy of the Norsemen changed. Sporadic raids turned into permanent conquests. In 865, the so-called Great Pagan Army landed in England, a united force that not only wanted to plunder, but to stay. Led by legendary figures such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, the Vikings conquered large parts of England. Especially in the east and north, they took hold. The region, which later became known as Danelag, was under Danish law and influence. This is where the Vikings founded cities, farmed, and lived side by side with the local population. York, called Jorvik by the Vikings, developed into a thriving trading center that attracted traders from all over Europe. Ireland and the Viking cities. Ireland was also strongly influenced by the Norsemen. At first, their attacks were feared. Monasteries such as Clonmacnoise and Glendalough were plundered, precious manuscripts burned or stolen. But soon, the Vikings founded their own settlements. Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford emerged from their camps and developed into important cities. Dublin became one of the most important slave trade metropolises in Europe. Thousands of prisoners from Ireland and England were sold here and brought to Spain or Byzantium via the Viking trade networks. At the same time, Dublin was a place of exchange. Silver coins from the Orient, jewelry from Scandinavia, and handicrafts from Ireland bear witness to the diversity of the culture. Scotland and the island worlds. The Scottish islands, Orkney, Shetland, Hebrides, were also of great interest to the Vikings. They offered bases on the way to Ireland and England and were fertile settlement areas themselves. Norwegian Vikings settled here, formed clans, and mixed with the local population. The Isle of Man in the Irish Sea became a center of Scandinavian Gaelic culture. Runestones and archaeological traces can still be found there today, showing the close connection between Norsemen and Celts. Conflict and adaptation. Of course, the expansion of the Vikings was not without resistance. Especially in England, King Alfred of Wessex rose up as an opponent in the late 9th century. Through clever tactics and a well-organized defense, he managed to stop the advance of the Vikings and create a counterweight to the Danelag. His successors continued this struggle and laid the foundation for a united England. But just as important as the battles was adaptation. Many Vikings embraced Christianity, married local women, and settled permanently. Their descendants were no longer pure Norsemen, but mixtures of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic culture. This fusion had a lasting impact on the art, language, and politics of the islands. Culture and heritage. The influence of the Vikings on the British Isles was profound. Linguistically, they have introduced numerous words into English. Simple everyday terms such as sky, egg, or husband come from Old Norse. In Ireland and Scotland, place names such as By or Thorpe are relics of their presence. Traces can also be seen in art and crafts. Jewelry, runestones, and ship graves bear witness to their culture. Excavations in cities such as York or Dublin have shown how strongly life was shaped by trade, crafts, and international contacts. Long-term significance. The Vikings' westward expansion fundamentally changed the British Isles. It destroyed old structures, but also led to the emergence of new cities and trading centers. It brought horror, but also cultural exchange. In the end, it was not only the swords, but the ships, markets, and family ties that shaped the islands. The Vikings came as strangers and conquerors, but they remained as part of the history of the British Isles. Their influence can still be felt today, be it in language, place names, or in the culture of remembrance. They have not only haunted British history, but helped shape it. Chapter 10. Expansion to the East, Rus and Byzantium. While the Western Vikings caused fear and terror in England, Ireland, and France, others turned to the east. The Swedish Vikings, often referred to as Varangians, used the rivers of Eastern Europe to open up trade routes, establish empires, and eventually reach the powerful centers of Byzantium and the Caliphate. This expansion was characterized less by plundering raids than by trade, diplomacy, and the establishment of new ruling structures. Rivers as trade routes. Eastern Europe was crisscrossed by large rivers. The Neva, Volga, Dnieper, and Don connected the Baltic Sea with the Black and Caspian Seas. For the Swedish Vikings, these rivers offered ideal routes to penetrate deep inland. With their light ships, they could not only sail across the Baltic Sea, but also sail up rivers, overcome rapids, and carry their ships overland when necessary. This created an extensive trade network that connected Scandinavia with Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic regions of the Middle East. Amber, furs, honey, and slaves from the north were exchanged for silver, spices, silk, and jewelry. The origin of Rus. In the 9th century, the Varangians formed the first ruling structures in Eastern Europe. According to the Nestor Chronicle, an old Russian source, Slavic tribes called the Vikings under Rurik, a Swedish prince, to Novgorod around 862 to establish order. From there, an empire developed that became known as Kiev in Rus. Rurik's successors, especially Oleg and Igor, extended the rule to the south. Under Oleg, Kiev was conquered and made the capital. From there, the Rus controlled the important trade routes on the Dnieper, which led directly to Byzantium. Relations with Byzantium. Rus and Byzantium had a complicated relationship. On the one hand, the Varangians repeatedly carried out raids against the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, which they called Miklagard. On the other hand, close trade and diplomatic relations developed. Several treaties secured trade rights for Rus and Byzantium. Varangians were allowed to spend the winter in Constantinople, trade, and even enter the service of the emperor. This union gave rise to the famous Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Nordic warriors that acted as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. This guard was notorious for its loyalty and fighting power and was used until the 14th century. The way to the east, the Caliphate. But the trade routes led not only to the south, but also to the east. Via the Volga, the Vikings reached the Caspian Sea and beyond, regions that were under the control of the Caliphate. Arab sources report that the Rus brought their goods as far as Baghdad. The silver trade was particularly important for the Vikings. Arab dirhams were brought to Scandinavia in huge quantities. Thousands of these coins can be found in graves and treasure finds in Sweden, proof of the close contacts between the Varangians and the Islamic world. Cultural contact and mixing. The expansion to the east led to a close mixing of cultures. In the cities of Rus, Slavs, Scandinavians, Finns, and other people lived side by side. The Varangians adopted Slavic language elements, while their rulers still bore Scandinavian names. Kiev and Rus developed into an important empire that became one of the most important players in Europe in the 10th century. The influence of the Vikings was particularly strong here, even though they were absorbed into the Slavic majority over the centuries. Christianization and change. In 988, Grand Duke Vladimir of Kiev was baptized and introduced Christianity as the state religion. This marked the beginning of a cultural change that pushed back the pagan past of the Vikings and Vikings. But the Scandinavian roots remained palpable in the art, in the legends, and in the dynastic connections that existed over generations. Heritage in the East. The Vikings' eastward expansion shows that they were far more than just marauders. They were skilled traders, founders of states, and diplomats. Without them, the emergence of Kiev and Rus would hardly be conceivable. At the same time, a different face of the Viking Age is evident here. While the Western Vikings were remembered primarily as horror figures who plundered monasteries and burned down villages, the Eastern Vikings were bridge builders between cultures. They connected the North with Byzantium and the Orient, circulating goods, people, and ideas, and thus laying the foundation for a new European order. Byzantium and the fascination of the foreign. The Vikings were particularly fascinated by Byzantium. The massive walls, the golden domes, and the wealth of the city impressed her deeply. Many Varangians not only served as mercenaries, but were inspired by Byzantine culture. Icons, jewelry, and even Byzantine coins found their way back to Scandinavia. The Varangian Guard remained a symbol of this connection. For many Vikings, it was the highlight of their careers to be in the service of the Emperor of Byzantium. They earned not only wealth there, but fame, and brought both home. A different image of the Vikings. The expansion to the east adds an important facet to the image of the Vikings. It shows that this people was not only able to spread fear, but to build bridges between worlds. They connected the frosty fjords of Scandinavia with the golden palaces of Constantinople, the lonely forests of Russia with the bazaars of Baghdad. In doing so, the Vikings made Eastern Europe a part of their history, and their history a part of Europe. Chapter 11. Settlements and Kingdoms. Normans, Dublin, York. The Vikings have long been described in historiography as marauding warriors and restless sailors. But just as formative as their raids was their ability to settle, found cities, and form new rulers. Their expansion led not only to short-term raids, but to lasting political and cultural changes in Europe. This is particularly evident in three regions: Normandy, Ireland, and northern England. From camps to cities, the settlement strategy. In the beginning, there were often simple camps, so-called long forts, fortified places that were built at river mouths or coasts. These served as safe harbors for ships and as starting points for raids. But over time, some of these camps grew into cities. The constant coming and going became a stay. Temporary camps became permanent centers of trade, politics, and culture. The Vikings knew how to choose their settlements in such a way that they were strategically and economically favorable. Estuaries such as the Seine, the Thames, or the Liffey offered access not only to the sea but also to the interior. Normandy, from enemy to vassal. One of the most impressive transformations was experienced by the region on the lower reaches of the Seine in France. Here, the Vikings had struck again and again in the 9th century, besieged Paris, and devastated large parts of the Frankish Empire. But instead of fighting the Norsemen again and again, the West Frankish king Charles the Simple decided to take a pragmatic step. In 911, he left the area that later became known as Normandy to a Viking leader named Rollo. In return, Rollo and his followers pledged to defend the country against further Viking attacks and to be baptized. This marked the beginning of the integration of the Vikings into the Frankish Empire. Within a few generations, the Normans, the men of the north, had become an integral part of European politics. Normandy developed into a powerful county. The Normans adopted French, adapting to the local culture, but also retaining elements of their Nordic origins. This union gave rise to a new ruling dynasty, which decisively changed English history in 1066 with William the Conqueror. Dublin, a city of the Vikings. Ireland also experienced the change from plundering to settlement. The Vikings had raided monasteries early on, but they soon realized the value of permanent bases. At the mouth of the River Liffey, they founded Dublin, which quickly developed into a central trading center. Dublin was not only a place of exchange of goods, but also the most important center of the slave trade in Western Europe. Prisoners from Ireland, England, and even from far away were sold here and brought to Spain and the Orient via the Viking trade routes. But Dublin was more than a market for people and goods. Archaeological finds show that the city was rich in crafts. Blacksmiths, goldsmiths, and woodcarvers produced objects of high quality. Street plans, foundations, and workshops give an insight into urban life. Viking rule in Ireland was not unchallenged. Local kings fought the Norsemen again and again, and there were changing alliances and enmities. But Dublin remained a center of power until the 11th century, shaped not only by Norsemen, but also by the Irish. York, the jewel in the Danelag. In England, York, called Jorvik by the Vikings, became the most important center. After the great pagan army conquered large parts of northern England in the 9th century, they made York the capital of the Danelag. Under Scandinavian rule, the city flourished. Traders from all over Europe came here. Markets offered goods from the Orient, Scandinavia, and the continent. The Vikings introduced new coins, established workshops, and promoted trade. Archaeological excavations in York have provided unique insights into life during this period. Remains of wooden houses, leatherwork, jewelry, and everyday objects show a lively urban life. The finds in the Coppergate district in particular make it clear that York was not only a military center, but also an economic and cultural heart. Integration and mixing. In all these regions, it is evident that the Vikings were not only destroyers, but also creators. They brought new structures, techniques, and trade networks, but also adapted to local conditions. Many embraced Christianity, married local women, and became part of existing societies. This integration was not a one-sided process. While the Vikings left their mark, they themselves were changed. Language, clothing, religion, and culture mixed. Thus, a new elite emerged in Normandy, a mixed culture of Nordic and Irish elements in Dublin, and a unique urban life in York. Long-term consequences. The founding of settlements and kingdoms by the Vikings had profound consequences for Europe. Normandy became one of the most influential regions of the Middle Ages. Dublin developed into a permanent city that is still one of the most important centers in Ireland today. York remained an important part of England, whose history is inextricably linked to the Norsemen. The Vikings thus proved their ability not only to destroy, but to create something new. They were not only warriors, but also founders, not just strangers, but soon part of the community. Their settlements and kingdoms show the other side of the Viking Age, the side of integration, trade, and cultural flourishing. Chapter 12. Women in the Viking World. power, roles, and myths. When you think of the Vikings, the focus is usually on bearded warriors with swords and shields. But the Viking world was not only shaped by men. Women played a role in this society that was remarkably strong compared to many other cultures of the early Middle Ages. They ran farms, determined inheritances, were guardians of the faith, and even appear in myths and sagas as warriors. The lives of Viking women were diverse and offered them freedoms that were often unthinkable in other European societies. Women's rights and position. In Scandinavia, women enjoyed relatively far-reaching rights in the early Middle Ages. They could inherit land, sign contracts, and divorce, rights that were reserved for men in many parts of Europe. A woman who was mistreated or dissatisfied by her husband could end the marriage by declaring in the presence of witnesses that she no longer wanted to live with him. Succession was also of great importance. Women could take over and manage property as daughters, sisters, or widows. Widows in particular often had a strong position, as they independently determined their farm and assets. These rights made women central figures in society. While the men were on raids or trading trips, the women ran the farms, organized the work, and made sure that everyday life functioned. Women in everyday life. The life of a Viking woman was characterized by work and responsibility. She was responsible for the household, took care of children, livestock, and supplies. She spun wool, weaved clothes, and made fabrics, an activity that was so important that looms often formed the heart of a house. But the role of women was not limited to the domestic sphere. She was also responsible for trade when the man was absent, and could conclude contracts with merchants as the lady of the house. Keychains that women wore on their belts were not only practical tools, but also symbols of their power over the farm and house. Women in myths and religion. In Norse mythology, women play a central role. Goddesses such as Freyja or Frigg embodied power, fertility, and wisdom. Freyja was not only the goddess of love, but also of magic and death. She took half of the fallen into her kingdom and was thus equal to Odin. The Norns, the goddesses of fate, also stood above everything. They determined the fate of gods and humans. These ideas were reflected in social perception. Women were seen as bearers of special powers and as mediators between the visible and invisible worlds. Magic and divination, especially the art of satyr, were often influenced by women. Seers, also called vulvas, had a high reputation in society. They traveled from farm to court, performing rituals and predicting the future. Their power lay not in weapons, but in knowledge and spirituality. Warriors and the question of the shield maiden. A particularly fascinating topic are the reports of warlike women, the so-called shield maidens. In the sagas, stories of women who grabbed sword and shield and took part in battles appear again and again. Famous figures such as Lagertha, the companion of Ragnar Lodbrok, are part of this tradition. For a long time, these stories were considered pure legends, but archaeological finds have changed the picture. In 2017, a famous graze in Birka, Sweden was re-examined. There, the remains of a high-ranking warrior had been found, along with weapons, horses, and game pieces for strategic planning. DNA analyses surprisingly showed it was a woman. Whether there were many shield maidens or whether they remained exceptions cannot be said definitively. But the possibility that women acted as warriors in certain situations shows that the Viking world was more flexible than was long assumed. Marriage, family, and social ties. Marriage was both a duty and an opportunity for women. It served not only to start a family, but also to promote political and economic networking. Marriages connected families, clans, and even entire regions. Women were often key people in alliances. Having children was important, but the role of the mother went far beyond giving birth. Women raised their children, told legends and myths, and thus shaped cultural memory. Especially in a society based on oral tradition, they were keepers of stories. Women on the road. Although many women stayed in the villages, there is also evidence that some women took part in trading trips and even expeditions. Female remains have been found in the graves of settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even Vineland, North America. This shows that the expansion of the Vikings was not exclusively male-dominated. Women helped to build new settlements and ensured that Viking culture could also be established in distant countries. The image of the woman in the sagas. The sagas paint a complex picture of Viking women. They appear as strong, self-confident figures who challenge men, swear revenge, or forge intrigues. Some women act as mediators, others as driving forces behind major feuds. It is particularly striking that women in the stories often exercise power through language and intellect. They urge their men to be brave or mock them when they seem cowardly. In a culture that valued honor so highly, a woman's word could be as powerful as a man's sword. A life between freedom and limitation. As much as Viking women had freedom compared to other cultures, their limitations were also noticeable. They were part of a patriarchal society in which men held political and military leadership. Violence against women was not excluded, and its value was often seen in connection with family and marriage. Nevertheless, it remains remarkable that women in the Viking world had a degree of freedom of action that was extraordinary for their time. They were not only companions, but also shapers of life, keepers of tradition, and in some cases, fighters themselves. Bequest. The image of Viking women still shapes the idea of a society that was tougher, but also more diverse than was long believed. They were not silent companions, but acting figures, in everyday life, in religion, in myths, and perhaps even on the battlefield. Chapter 13. Art, Runes, and Poetry. The Viking Age was an era that is often associated with war, plundering, and ships. But beyond the martial images, this people developed a remarkable culture, rich in symbols, ornaments, and words. Art, runes, and poetry played a central role in her life. They served not only to beautify, but also to promote identity, religion, and cultural memory. Runes, writing, and magic. The runes were the most important writing system of the Vikings. Its origin dates back to the early Germanic cultures, but in the Viking Age, the so-called Younger Futhark developed. With only 16 characters, it was simpler than the older system, but still versatile. Runes were carved on wood, bone, stone, and metal. They served practical purposes, such as marking possessions or trade goods, but also ceremonial inscriptions. Runestones, which have been found throughout Scandinavia, tell of deeds, journeys, or memorial services for the deceased. They are valuable sources because they give us insights into the self-image of the Vikings. But runes had more than just a written function. They were considered magical. Odin himself is said to have discovered the runes when he sacrificed himself at the world tree Yggdrasil. Runes could offer protection, pronounce curses, or bring good luck. Many people wore amulets decorated with runes or carved signs into their weapons. Jewelry and ornaments. The art of the Vikings was characterized by ornamentation. Abstract patterns, intricate depictions of animals, and geometric shapes adorned weapons, jewelry, and everyday objects. Typical were intertwined lines that formed animals or dragons in endless patterns, a style that is still known today as Viking art. Silver played a special role. It was not only a means of payment, but also material for filigree brooches, bracelets, and necklaces. Often, they were designed in such a way that parts could be broken off and used as weight money. But at the same time, they were an expression of status and beauty. The Vikings knew how to combine art and function. A sword pommel could be a weapon and a work of art at the same time. A ship, both a means of transport and a symbol of power. Picture stones and engravings. In addition to jewelry and everyday art, the Vikings created impressive picture stones. On Gotland in Sweden, monumental stones were decorated with scenes from myths, battles, or journeys. Ships, warriors, gods, and animals tell stories here in pictures that offered people orientation. Wood carvings also decorated houses, temples, and ships. Dragon heads on longships were not only ornamental, but were intended to intimidate enemies and ward off evil spirits. Poetry and skald tradition. In addition to the visual arts, poetry was the heart of Viking culture. In a society without books, the spoken word was the most important medium. Skalds, poets at the court of kings and chieftains, had a special position. They preserved history, praised rulers, and praised warriors in elaborate verses. The skalds used a complex language, full of metaphors and paraphrases, so-called knarrings. A sword could be called the whetstone of battle, the sea the swan path. This poetic language was not only art, but also a sign of education and prestige. Poetry served several purposes. It entertained, it created identity, and it preserved the memory of great deeds. It was often so elaborate that it was easy to remember, an important feature in a culture based on oral tradition. The sagas and Eddas. The most famous texts of the Viking Age were not recorded in writing until later, but they go back to oral traditions. The sagas, especially the Icelandic sagas, depict the life of families, fights, and feuds. They are not only stories, but also sources about everyday life, law, and culture. The Eddas, a collection of mythological poems, contain stories about gods, heroes, and the fate of the world. They are a key to understanding Norse mythology and show how deeply intertwined religion and poetry were. Music and instruments. Music also played a role in the life of the Vikings. Bone flutes, harps, and simple percussion instruments have been archaeologically proven. Music accompanied festivals, rituals, and stories. Songs were probably used to preserve history and create community. Art as a mirror of society. Viking art was not an isolated world. It reflected what was important to them: honor, community, religion, and the sea. Runestones told of journeys and battles, jewelry showed wealth and solidarity, poetry praised the heroes of the time. Viking art was also internationally influenced. Contacts with Byzantium, the Orient, and Western Europe brought new stylistic elements that were integrated into Nordic forms. A bangle from Dublin could have Arabic patterns, while a sword from Scandinavia showed Frankish influences. A lasting legacy. Even today, we are fascinated by the runes, the artistic patterns, and the powerful stories of the Vikings. They show that this people not only destroyed, but also created. Her art was an expression of a culture that lived between harshness and beauty, everyday life and myth, functionality and aesthetics. The Vikings left us not only ships and weapons, but also images, words, and symbols that still have an impact today. Her art is a window into their soul, raw, mysterious, and full of life. Chapter 14. Religion and Christianization, from the pagan sacrifice to the cross. The Viking Age was an era of transition. In the beginning, the people of Scandinavia lived firmly rooted in the ancient belief in Odin, Thor, Freyja, and the other gods of Norse mythology. Sacrificial festivals, sacred groves, and runic magic shaped religious life. But over the centuries, Christianity became more and more prevalent. This change was not sudden, but a long process in which old and new forms of belief coexisted for generations, fought each other, and finally mixed. Pagan religion and victim culture. The religion of the Vikings was closely linked to nature. Sacred groves, springs, and mountains were considered places of the gods. Sacrifices were a central part of worship. Animals, food, and in rare cases, people were offered to the gods. The annual festivals were particularly important. The Yule festival in winter asked for fertility and light in the dark time. In spring, sacrifices were made for good harvests. And in autumn, people thanked the gods for the yields. These festivals were not only religious acts, but also occasions for community, feasts, and celebrations. There were no priests in the narrower sense. Instead, it was chiefs or respected men and women who led sacrificial acts. Religion was thus part of social and political life. Encounter with Christianity. The Vikings encountered Christianity early on, initially as enemies. Monasteries were the first victims of their raids, and the Christian monks portrayed the Norsemen as pagan demons. But at the same time, there were also peaceful contacts. Merchants and travelers brought Christian symbols with them, and as early as the 9th century, crosses can be found next to pagan amulets in Viking graves. Some Vikings were baptized, not necessarily out of conviction, but for political and economic reasons. A Christian ruler could more easily establish trade relations or conclude treaties. Baptisms became diplomatic gestures that could be reversed just as quickly. Missionaries and kings. The actual Christianization began when missionaries from the Frankish Empire and England came specifically to Scandinavia. Men like Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, traveled to Denmark and Sweden in the 9th century, He founded churches and preached the faith, even if his successes were limited at first. The decisive step came through the kings themselves. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason played an important role, who promoted Christianization around 995. His successor, Olaf the Saint, performed the baptism by force. Anyone who refused had to reckon with punishment. The process in Denmark was similar under Harald Blauzon, who was baptized around 965, and thus sent a clear signal. Resistance and mixing. Christianization did not meet with approval everywhere. Many people held on to the old faith. Some even openly opposed the new rules. Stories tell of farmers who refused to give up their sacrificial sites, or of uprisings against missionary kings. But mixing occurred just as often. Amulets that showed the cross and Thor's hammer at the same time are a symbol of this transitional period. People sought safety in both belief systems until Christianity slowly took hold. The baptism of Iceland. A special chapter took place in Iceland. There, around the year 1000, the leading men decided on the acceptance of Christianity at the Althing, the large popular assembly. After long discussions, a compromise was agreed. Officially, the country was to become Christian, but everyone was still allowed to secretly worship the old gods. This pragmatic approach prevented bloodshed and allowed for a relatively peaceful transition. Changes in life. With Christianity, everyday life changed. Churches emerged, new rituals shaped the year, and the culture of writing spread. Monks began to write down sagas and myths that had previously only been handed down orally. Paradoxically, we owe it to Christianity that many pagan stories have been preserved to this day. The legal system also changed. Christian morals influenced laws, especially in matters of marriage, inheritance, and violence. Burials were influenced by Christianity. Instead of ship graves and rich grave goods, simple burial under the cross prevailed. The fall of the old gods. Odin, Thor, and Freyja disappeared from religious life, but they lived on in myths and poetry. In folk culture, customs reminiscent of pagan traditions persisted for a long time. Some festivals, such as the Yule Festival, have been converted into Christian forms without completely losing their original character. The legacy of Christianization. The Christianization of the Vikings was not a simple break, but a complex process. It marked the transition from a pagan society rooted in myth and belief in nature to a Christian culture that became part of the European Middle Ages. For the Vikings, this meant entering a new world order. They were no longer regarded as pagan outsiders, but as equal partners in the Christian kingdoms of Europe. But at the same time, they preserved a piece of their old world in their legends and symbols, which fascinate us to this day. Chapter 15. The Normans and the Conquest of England. The history of the Vikings did not end with the classic raids. Rather, their descendants continued the work in a new way. This is particularly evident in Normandy, the region in present-day France that was once a concession to feared Norsemen and later became the starting point of one of the most important events of the Middle Ages, the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The beginnings of Normandy. By the early 10th century, the Vikings had become a constant threat to the Frankish Empire. Again and again, they sailed up the Seine, plundered cities, and even besieged Paris. The West Franconian king Charles the Simple was looking for a solution. In 911, the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Apt was signed. Land on the Seine was given to the Viking leader Rollo and his men. In return, they pledged to defend the territory and embrace the Christian faith. This area soon received the name Normandy, the land of the Norsemen. Here, the Vikings largely abandoned their raids and became settled princes. They adopted the French language and culture, but they retained their military spirit and energy. Integration and advancement. Within a few generations, the Normans had developed into a powerful political force. They merged Scandinavian and Frankish traditions, developed a strong feudal system, and built castles that secured their power. Their dukes were ambitious and skillful. They promoted trade and agriculture, strengthened their armies, and were constantly looking for new ways to expand. Soon, they were looking across the English Channel, where England was shaken by internal conflicts. England in the 11th century. England was a country in upheaval in the 11th century. After centuries of Viking raids and rule in the Danelag, a strong Anglo-Saxon kingdom had formed. King Edward the Confessor reigned until 1066, but his death without direct heirs led to a crisis. Three men laid claim to the throne: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English nobleman; Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway; and William, the Duke of Normandy. Each of them had reasons and supporters for their claims, and each was ready to fight for the crown by force. William the Conqueror. William, known as the Bastard because of his illegitimate birth, was a determined and experienced ruler. He claimed that Edward had promised him the crown, and that Harold Godwinson, who had been taken prisoner in Normandy, had taken an oath to support William's claim. When Harold nevertheless had himself crowned king, William saw it as betrayal and an opportunity to assert his claim with the sword. The Battle of Hastings. William gathered an army of Normans, Bretons, and French. With the support of the Pope, he sailed to England in the autumn of 1066. At the same time, Harald Hardrada had invaded with a Norwegian army, but was defeated at Stamford Bridge by Harold Godwinson. No sooner had Harold won this victory than he had to march against Wilhelm. On 14 October 1066, the two armies met at Hastings. The battle lasted all day and was fierce. Harald's shield wall held out at first, but the Normans relied on repeated attacks with archers, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Finally, they broke through the ranks and Harold fell, according to legend, by an arrow. With Harold's death, the battle was decided. William marched to London and was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey at Christmas 1066. Consequences of the conquest. The Norman conquest fundamentally changed England. William introduced the feudal system, had castles built, and distributed land to his followers. The Normans brought with them a new language that had a lasting impact on English. Many terms of administration, law, and courtly culture come from French. The rule of the Normans was not only militarily but also culturally formative. They strengthened the church, promoted monasteries, and relied on written administration. With the Domesday Book, a comprehensive land and tax survey, Wilhelm created a unique document that still exists today. The Normans as heirs of the Vikings. Even though the Normans had long been Christians and spoke French, they still carried the heritage of the Vikings. Their energy, their thirst for adventure, and their military clout had their roots in the Nordic tradition. The conquest of England was in a way the climax of the Viking Age. A descendant of Rollo, the old Viking chieftain, sat on the throne of an empire that had previously suffered decades from the attacks of the Norsemen. Further rise of the Normans. The history of the Normans did not end with England. They also conquered southern Italy and Sicily, founded a powerful kingdom there, and became one of the most dynamic forces of the High Middle Ages. From simple Vikings who once roamed France's coasts, they had developed into rulers who changed the map of Europe. Bequest. The Norman conquest of England is one of the most drastic events in European history. It connected the world of the Vikings with the world of medieval Europe. It showed how feared looters could become kings who formed entire nations. The legacy of the Normans lives on today, in England's culture, language, and history. William the Conqueror is a symbol of how the descendants of the Vikings rewrote the fate of Europe. Chapter 16. Discoveries in the Atlantic, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. The Vikings were not only warriors and traders, but also explorers. Driven by a thirst for adventure, necessity, and the urge for new land, they ventured further out into the Atlantic than any people in Europe had done before. Their ships carried them to unknown regions, and their settlements on distant islands testified to a courage that still inspires admiration today. Iceland, the gateway to the Atlantic Ocean. Iceland was settled around the year 870. Although monks from Ireland had probably reached the island before, it was the Vikings who settled it permanently. It is said that it was the Norwegian chief Ingolfur Arnarson who was the first settler to come to Iceland. According to legend, he threw the gods of his court into the sea and settled where they were washed ashore, in today's Reykjavik. The reasons for the settlement of Iceland were manifold. Some chiefs fled political struggles in Norway. Others sought new land as the population in Scandinavia grew. Iceland offered fertile pastures, abundant fishing grounds, and timber from flotsam and debris, even if the barren landscape demanded hard work. A unique society emerged in Iceland. There was no king, but free farmers who met annually at the Althing to pass laws and settle disputes. This system made Iceland a country with remarkable self-government. Greenland, the land of ice. But the Vikings were not satisfied with Iceland. Around 985, Eric the Red, a Norwegian settler who had been exiled from Iceland, sailed even further west. He reached a huge, ice-covered land that he called Greenland, presumably to attract settlers. Eric founded two main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Here, the Vikings lived from cattle breeding, hunting, and trade. Walrus teeth, skins, and hunting products were brought to Europe, while grain and iron had to be imported. Life in Greenland was hard. The climate was harsh, the soils barren, and the settlers were constantly dependent on imports. Nevertheless, the communities survived for several centuries. It was not until the 15th century that they disappeared without a trace. Whether due to climate change, conflicts with the Inuit, or a lack of trade contacts remains a mystery to this day. Vinland, the discovery of America. The greatest discovery of the Vikings, however, lay even further west. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland. He reached a land that is said to be rich in vines and fertile soil, hence the name Vinland. Archaeological finds confirm that the Vikings did indeed reach America, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. In Lanza Os Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, researchers discovered remains of a Viking settlement, houses, tools, and traces of crafts. The Vikings tried to gain a foothold in Vinland, but the settlements were not permanent. Conflicts with the native peoples, logistical difficulties, and distance probably led to a quick end to the adventure. The significance of the discoveries. The voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland show the seafaring skills of the Vikings. They crossed the North Atlantic in open ships, despite storms, fog, and icebergs. Their navigation, courage, and organization made them the first Europeans to reach the American continent. But the significance of these discoveries was not only geographical. They also show how much the Vikings were willing to push their boundaries. While many peoples of Europe hardly looked beyond their home region, the Vikings dared to take the leap into uncertainty, and thus changed world history. Everyday life in the new settlements. Life in the Atlantic colonies was characterized by adaptation. In Iceland, settlers had to deal with volcanoes, long winters, and limited resources. In Greenland, they lived on the edge of the ice, hunted seals and polar bears, and were constantly looking for new trade goods. In all settlements, community was decisive. Without cooperation, survival would have been impossible. The women played a central role as they organized everyday life and made sure that the farms functioned while the men were at sea. Myths and stories. The trips to the west also found their way into the sagas. The Grænlendinga saga and the Erik saga Rauda tell of the discoveries and encounters with foreign peoples. They tell of adventures, struggles, and defeats, but also of amazement at the new world. These stories were passed down in Iceland for centuries before they were written down in the Middle Ages. Today, they are valuable sources that complement archaeological finds. The end of the Atlantic settlements. Despite their courage and discoveries, the Vikings were unable to hold on to their colonies permanently. Iceland remained and developed an independent culture that still flourishes today. Greenland, however, was abandoned, and Vinland remained a short chapter in history. But the spirit of these discoveries endured. The voyages of the Vikings were in anticipation of the great expeditions of modern times. They showed that the Atlantic was not an insurmountable obstacle, but a bridge to new worlds. Bequest. The discoveries in the Atlantic are among the greatest achievements of the Viking Age. They made the Norsemen pioneers of global history. Their traces in Iceland, Greenland, and North America are a reminder that the Vikings were not only destroyers, but also explorers. People who had the courage to sail where no one had gone before. Chapter 17. The End of the Viking Age. Climate Change, Kingdoms, and Christianity. The Viking Age lasted from the late 8th to the 11th century. It began with the shock of Lindisfarne in 793 and ended in the course of the 11th century when the once feared Northmen became kings, traders, and Christians. This end did not come suddenly, but was the result of a variety of developments. Climate change, political upheavals, and advancing Christianity led to the Vikings gradually giving up their role as predatory seafarers and being integrated into the world of medieval Europe. Climatic changes. The climate played an important role. During the early Viking Age, Northern Europe experienced a relatively mild phase, sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period. This climate made agriculture possible, even in regions such as Iceland and South Greenland, which would otherwise have been difficult to cultivate. But in the 11th century, conditions deteriorated. Shorter summers and harsher winters made agriculture more difficult. This led to problems especially in the peripheral areas such as Greenland. Harvests failed, livestock died, and dependence on imports increased. As the trade routes weakened, the settlements gradually disappeared. Rise of the kingdoms. Another reason for the end of the Viking Age was the emergence of stronger kingdoms in Scandinavia. At the beginning of the era, the region was fragmented into small tribal areas and jarldoms. This fragmentation favored the raids, as many young men without land and power sought their fortune abroad. But over the centuries, power was consolidated. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, kingdoms arose that extended their rule over larger areas. These kings relied on taxes, standing armies, and Christian structures. They had little interest in their subjects plundering Europe. Instead, they wanted to build stable empires. Denmark in particular played an important role in the 11th century. Under King Canute the Great, a North Sea empire was created, uniting Denmark, England, and Norway. In doing so, the Vikings showed that they were no longer just looters, but rulers of European stature themselves. Christianity. Christianity was one of the decisive factors that ended the Viking Age. Missionaries had been trying to bring the faith to Scandinavia since the 9th century. Initially, this met with resistance, but from the 10th century onwards, the kings began to systematically impose Christianity. Harald Blausson in Denmark was baptized around 965. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Saint introduced Christianity to Norway, and it prevailed in Sweden in the 11th century. Baptism was often not a voluntary decision of the people, but was enforced with political pressure and sometimes violence. With Christianity, society changed profoundly. Old pagan sacrificial sites were banned, churches were built, and monasteries were founded. The belief in Odin and Thor gave way to the cross, and the former gods became figures of the past. Changes in Europe. The situation also changed outside Scandinavia. The European empires had learned from the early Viking attacks. Coastal fortifications, castles, and better organized armies made raids less rewarding. Monasteries and villages were no longer the easy targets they had once been. In addition, the Vikings established themselves as rulers in many regions. In England, Danes ruled in the Danelagh. In Ireland, they founded cities such as Dublin. And in Normandy, they became vassals of the Frankish king. Enemies had become neighbors, and the new generations had long since become part of the societies that had once invaded their ancestors. Cultural heritage. With the end of the Viking Age, the cultural heritage did not disappear. On the contrary, many of the old traditions lived on in sagas, myths, and folk beliefs. Runestones continued to be erected, even if Christian symbols were placed next to them. The language of the Vikings, Old Norse, had a lasting influence on the development of English and other languages. Place names, words, and expressions remind us of their presence to this day. The idea of the courageous, free warrior also remained in people's minds, but now shifted to the world of legends. The symbolic end, Stamford Bridge and Hastings. Historians often place two battles in 1066 as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. At Stamford Bridge in England, King Harold Godwinson defeated the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, who had invaded with a large army. It was a last major Viking invasion that ended in a crushing defeat. Only a few weeks later, Harold himself was defeated at Hastings by William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings who had settled in Normandy. This made it clear. The time of the marauding Vikings was over, but their legacy lived on in new ruling houses. From raid to domination. At the end of the Viking Age, the Norsemen had changed fundamentally. They were no longer pirates and plunderers, but kings, dukes, and Christians. Their ships were no longer tools of fear, but means of trade. Their sagas and stories were written down and shaped the literature of Europe. The end of the Viking Age was not a downfall, but a transformation. The seafarers became rulers, the pagans Christians, the strangers neighbors. But the memory of the Viking era remained alive, as an era of departure, courage, and discovery. The Vikings did not disappear. They became part of medieval Europe. And perhaps that was their greatest victory, that they did not lose themselves, but left their mark indelibly on history. Chapter 18. Aftermath and Legends. The Vikings in the Middle Ages. With the official end of the Viking Age in the 11th century, the Norsemen did not disappear from history, but changed. They became part of the Christian kingdoms, merged with the cultures of Europe, and left behind a rich legacy of myths, sagas, and legends. While some forgot their roots, others consciously held on to memories that turned the image of the wild, free warrior into an immortal figure. From enemies to neighbors. In the High Middle Ages, the Vikings were no longer robbing pirates. Stable kingdoms had formed in Scandinavia. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden now appeared as Christian powers that were integrated into the political structure of Europe. Instead of raiding coastal cities, they sent envoys to the papal court, took part in crusades, and participated in European trade. The once feared Norsemen had become rulers. King Canute the Great, for example, who ruled over a North Sea empire in the 11th century, was no longer portrayed in chronicles as a Viking, but as a respectable king. This also changed the image that contemporaries had of them. Legends in Iceland. Especially in Iceland, the memory of the Viking Age lived on. From the 12th century onwards, the great sagas, literary masterpieces that told of family feuds, travels, and fights, were created there. These sagas were more than just stories. They preserved the cultural memory of an entire era. The heroes of the sagas were often Viking ancestors who lived in a world between honor and fate. Stories such as those of Egil Skallagrimsson or the sagas about the Njals family kept alive the ideal of the strong, independent man and the clever, influential woman. At the same time, the old myths were collected and recorded in the Eddas. So the Nordic gods survived with Odin, Thor, and Loki, even though it had long since ceased to be a living religion. Europe remembers the threat. While the Scandinavians themselves proudly told their past, in other parts of Europe, the memory of the Vikings remained marked by fear. Chroniclers in England, France, and Germany described them as the scourge of God, who burned down churches and brought disaster. This negative memory was passed on from generation to generation. For many monasteries and regions, the Viking invasions were a trauma that lived on in documents, songs, and prayers. Centuries later, some coastal residents still feared that the Norsemen might return. Integration into the Christian world. At the same time, the image of the pagan disappeared with Christianization. Scandinavian kings sent troops to the Crusades, founded bishoprics, and promoted monasteries. The former enemies of Christendom were now brothers in the faith. This led to a slow fusion of memory. The Viking Age was glorified as a closed epoch, while the present was determined by the Christian kings of the north. The Normans as the new Vikings. A special case were the Normans, descendants of the Vikings who had settled in Normandy. They continued the warlike legacy of their ancestors, but now within the framework of Christian politics. With William the Conqueror, they placed the English crown in Norman hands in 1066. Later, they conquered Sicily and southern Italy and founded a powerful kingdom there. While their Viking roots were hardly emphasized in these regions, their military energy and thirst for adventure were unmistakable. Legends of the Golden Age. In the Middle Ages, the idea developed that the Viking Age was a golden age of freedom and strength. Especially in Iceland, where the population lived in the shadow of powerful kings, many remembered with pride the time when free peasants made their own laws and heroes roamed the sea. This memory was not always historically accurate, but it shaped the self-image of entire generations. Vikings became symbols of a proud past which people invoked to strengthen their own identity. The change in the narrative. Interestingly, a double narrative began as early as the Middle Ages. In Scandinavia, the Vikings were revered as heroes who embodied courage, honor, and a spirit of discovery. In Central Europe, they were still regarded as barbarians, whose cruelty could only be overcome by the cross. These contradictory memories explain why the image of the Vikings is so multifaceted, between bloody robbers and heroic explorers. Symbols and artifacts. Even in the Middle Ages, many Viking symbols remained in circulation. Runestones continue to be erected, but often supplemented with Christian symbols. Jewelry and weapons were passed down in families, and some traditions in festivals and customs had clearly pagan roots. Nordic motifs even appeared in art. Churches in Scandinavia still show wood carvings with intricate animal patterns reminiscent of the ancient ornamentation of the Vikings. Political legacy. The aftermath of the Viking Age was also felt politically. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden developed into important powers of the Middle Ages. Their rulers traced family trees back to mythical Vikings to underpin their legitimacy. In England, on the other hand, the experience with the Danish kings and the Normans remained a formative element of history. The Danelag and the Norman rule permanently changed the language, the law, and culture. In the Middle Ages, the Vikings did not disappear, but changed into memory and reality. They became kings, merchants, and Christians, but their image remained alive. As enemies in the chronicles of the monasteries, as heroes in the sagas of Iceland, as ancestors in the Norman family trees. The aftermath of this period shows how strongly the Vikings shaped the imagination of Europe. They were more than just a chapter of history. They became a legend that oscillated between pride and terror and reverberates to this day. Chapter 19. The rediscovery of the Vikings in modern times. After the end of the Middle Ages, the immediate memory of the Viking Age gradually faded. It lived on in legends, place names, and old chronicles. But in the consciousness of most people, the Norsemen were above all distant figures of a bygone era. It was not until modern times, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, that a new confrontation with this past began, a rediscovery that stylized the Vikings as heroic figures and shaped their image for the modern world. Early perception, barbarians and pagans. In the centuries after the end of the Viking Age, representations from a Christian perspective dominated. Chroniclers and clergymen had described the Norsemen as cruel robbers, pagan barbarians who burned down churches and brought disaster. This image persisted for a long time in Europe, especially in the regions that were severely affected by the raids. For many historians of the early modern period, the Vikings were therefore a warning example of godless savagery. They were considered enemies of civilization, whose time had been overcome by Christianity. The awakening of interest. In the 16th and 17th centuries, however, scholarly interest in old sources grew. In Scandinavia, the Icelandic sagas and the Eddas began to be systematically collected and studied. Scholars realized that these texts were not just legends, but valuable testimonies of an entire culture. With the Enlightenment, this trend intensified. People were looking for the origins of nations, for the roots of language, culture, and history. For the Scandinavian countries, this meant a return to the Viking Age as a heroic past. Romanticism and nationalism. However, the actual rediscovery of the Vikings took place in the Romantic period in the 19th century. Poets, artists, and historians searched for heroic role models, legends, and myths that strengthened national self-confidence. The Vikings fit perfectly into this picture. Brave sailors, free men, intrepid fighters. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Vikings became symbolic figures of national identity. Their stories were glorified, their deeds idealized. Runestones, ship tombs, and artifacts were excavated and presented as testimonies to a glorious past. The fascination also grew outside Scandinavia. In England and Germany, writers and painters took up the topic. Wagner resurrected Nordic myths in his operas, and history painters depicted heroic battles, often with romantic exaggeration. Archaeological discoveries. At the same time, archaeology developed. In the 19th century, systematic excavations began, which substantiated many legends with tangible finds. Particularly spectacular was the discovery of ship graves such as Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway. These finds showed that the Vikings had not only been robbers, but artisans, traders, and builders. Their intricately carved ships, trinkets, and everyday objects made it clear that it was a highly developed culture. The image of the Vikings in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the image of the Vikings changed fundamentally. The feared barbarians became heroic ancestors whose virtues were emphasized in the age of nationalism, freedom, courage, thirst for adventure. Especially in Norway, which was still under Danish and later Swedish rule at the time, the Vikings became symbols of resistance and independence. They embodied a proud past that was conjured up in the struggle for national self-determination. Misuse of Viking images. But this enthusiasm also had its downsides. In the 20th century, nationalist and racist movements tried to co-opt the Vikings as alleged Aryan heroes. Especially in Nazi Germany, runes and Nordic myths were misused for propaganda. This chapter shows how flexible the image of the Vikings was. It could be used for ideals of freedom as well as for ideologies of oppression. The Vikings in the 20th century. After the Second World War, the picture became more differentiated. Historians tried to research the Viking Age in more detail, scientifically without romantic or ideological distortions. Archaeological finds, linguistic studies, and new methods opened up a more complex picture. The Vikings were traders, farmers, craftsmen, explorers, and warriors. At the same time, they experienced a new flowering in popular culture. Films, novels, and later television series made them heroic figures again. Often the depiction remained cliched, with horned helmets that are historically incorrect, but the fascination was unbroken. The heritage of modern times. The rediscovery of the Vikings in modern times shows how history is constructed. Pagan barbarians became national heroes in the 19th century, misused symbols in the 20th century, and fascinating figures in series and museums in the 21st century. Their true story lies somewhere in between. They were people of a bygone era, shaped by the challenges of their world. But their aftermath proves that they were far more than just an epoch. They became a myth that is constantly reinventing itself. Chapter 20. The Vikings Today. Myth, Research, and Pop Culture. The Viking Age ended almost 1,000 years ago, but its fascination remains unbroken. Today, the Norsemen are omnipresent in films, television series, computer games, festivals, and museum exhibitions. They have become symbols that reach far beyond their historical reality. The image of the Vikings fluctuates between scientific precision, romantic exaggeration, and pure fantasy. But it is precisely in this complexity that its lasting impact lies. Archaeology and science. The Vikings have a firm place in modern research. Archaeological excavations in Scandinavia, Great Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and even Canada have drawn an increasingly detailed picture of her life. The discovery of Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland finally confirmed that the Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the Americas, almost 500 years before Columbus. New finds in Greenland and Iceland show how they organized their colonies and how strongly they were affected by climatic changes. Modern techniques such as DNA analysis have expanded our knowledge. They prove, for example, that women were actually buried as warriors, as the famous grave of Birka shows. The genetic diversity of the Viking Age has also become clear. They were by no means uniformly Nordic, but strongly intertwined with other peoples through trade, travel, and conquest. Museums and cultural centers. In Scandinavia and beyond, museums have made the Vikings the central theme. The Viking Ship Museum in Oslo shows the magnificently preserved ships of Oseberg and Gostad, which provide insights into art, technology, and funeral culture. In Denmark, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde offers not only exhibitions, but also replica ships that visitors can experience for themselves. These places are more than just historical exhibitions. They are bridges between the past and the present. They show the fascination of ships, runes, and artifacts and make the Viking world tangible. Vikings as a pop culture phenomenon. In addition to science, the Vikings have developed a life of their own in pop culture. Films like The Vikings, 1958, or series like Vikings and the Last Kingdom have shaped the image that many people have of them today. These depictions are often a mix of historical facts and artistic freedom, full of blood, honor, intrigue, and epic battles. Computer games such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla or fantasy worlds such as Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones also take up motifs from the Viking world. Horned helmets, even if they are historically incorrect, have established themselves as an integral part of popular culture. This reveals an exciting phenomenon. While historians differentiate, an image lives on in pop culture that is at once romantic, brutal, and heroic. Vikings become mirrors for longings for freedom, adventure, and an original world. Festivals and reenactment. In many countries today, there are Viking festivals, markets, and reenactment groups. People dress in reconstructed garments, make handicrafts, fight with swords and shields, or sail on replica longships. These scenes are not just gimmicks. They are part of a living culture of remembrance that tries to make history tangible. Many reenactment groups place great emphasis on historical accuracy, while festivals tend to focus on entertainment. But both show that the Vikings have long since become an integral part of modern identity. Symbolism and identity. The Vikings are also used in the symbolism of modern nations. In Scandinavia, they are considered part of the cultural heritage of which they are proud of. Cities like York or Dublin use their Viking past for tourism. In Iceland, the sagas are part of the national identity, and in Norway, the ships are seen as symbols of pioneering spirit and the urge to explore. But there are also problematic sides. Some extremist groups have tried to co-opt runes or Viking images. Historians and museums therefore emphasize that the Vikings were not a homogeneous race, but a diverse, open culture that was constantly changing. Science and myth in dialogue. Today's perception of the Vikings is characterized by a dialogue between science and myth. On the one hand, we know more about their lives than ever before, about their diet, their trade routes, their religion, and their genes. On the other hand, the myth of the wild warrior and free seafarer lives on stronger than ever. This contrast is not a contradiction, but shows the strength of the topic. The Vikings are projection surfaces for research and imagination at the same time. They are historical reality and mythical exaggeration, a combination that makes them immortal. Why the Vikings still fascinate today? Why do the Vikings exert such a fascination? Perhaps because they unite opposites. They were brutal warriors and at the same time skilled traders. They were pagans and later Christians. They destroyed and created at the same time. They lived on the edge of the known world and yet penetrated into distant lands. In a time when adventure and freedom are often limited by structures and technology, the Vikings appear as a symbol of an era in which humans still conquered the world with courage and ships. Today, the Vikings are more than just a historical epic. They are myth, research topic, and cultural asset at the same time. Whether in museums, in series, or at festivals, they remain alive. Their true story was complex, contradictory, and diverse. But that is precisely why they are still effective today. Because the Vikings show us that humans were always more than warriors or farmers. They were explorers, artists, storytellers, and dreamers. And perhaps that is their greatest legacy, that they still make us dream of new horizons 1,000 years later.